I ran the Boston Marathon in 2:45:27, and it was the slowest marathon that I ever raced. In this video, I want to talk about all the mistakes that I made, both in training and on race day to execute the Boston Marathon, so that when you race Boston, you don't make all the mistakes that I did, because I made some classic ones. I also made some mistakes that I don't think a lot of runners talk about too much. So let's get going on making your Boston Marathon the best ever without all the mistakes that I made. Now, the Boston Marathon is a notoriously difficult course, not only because it's a net downhill course, but because it's actually a very hilly course. It has a lot of uphills as well. And when you combine very large uphills at very inopportune times during the race with a net downhill elevation profile, you're creating a marathon course that is going to be extraordinarily difficult to navigate. And so let's talk first about the training that is necessary so that when you line up on race day, you're actually prepared for the demands of the race course. Okay, let's start with some of the basics that we've got to get right when we're training for the Boston Marathon. First of all, we've got to run hills, not just up hills, but down hills. Right now, I'm running a big downhill grade because this is providing the eccentric muscle contractions that are going to prepare you for the demands of the downhills at Boston. Everyone loves doing uphill workouts to prepare for Heartbreak Hill, and of course that's really important. I actually think it's more important to practice for the downhills. Studies have shown that the best hill runners are just those runners that have the highest aerobic development. So if you focus on that and steeling your legs for the demands of those downhills, you are going to be in a really good position. So how do you actually do that? Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways depending on how you want to structure things. Let's stop here and talk about some of those workouts that you can do. Now, you can do long, easier workouts, or you can do shorter, more intense workouts to prepare you for those downhills. And because of the repeated bout effect, you're going to adapt very quickly to these downhill sessions. So the first thing you could do is maybe a 30-second or a 1-minute downhill pickup or stride. You just want to give your body a little bit of exposure to running fast on a downhill, and this is a good introductory way to do it. The next thing that you can do are just downhill repetitions. Now, this sounds kind of strange, but this isn't really a heavy breathing aerobic workout. Your heart rate is not going to completely correspond to the effort that you're putting in during these kinds of workouts. This is a purely muscular workout. We really just want to kind of hammer the legs a little bit and really get on those downhills and hammer those legs for, a couple minutes at a time, doing maybe, 4 to 8 2-minute downhill repetitions at, say, a 5K or a 10K effort are a little bit of a step up from those shorter 30-second to 1-minute repetitions that might be a little bit faster. And then finally, the last thing that you can do, which is probably the most specific thing for training for Boston, are long downhills. So if you live in an area where you can find a 2 or 3, 4 mile downhill segment, maybe you live near a mountain range in Vermont or New Hampshire or Massachusetts, or maybe you're out here in Colorado where I am and you can access some of these big downhills. Running some of those downhills at marathon pace, or even a little bit faster than marathon pace, maybe 10 seconds a mile, is another really strong stimulus to do to prepare yourself for Boston. And as you work through these workouts, you're gonna find that you actually recover from them fairly quickly. So the first one is probably going to wreck your legs. That's okay, that's part of the process. The next session of downhills that you do, you're probably not going to experience nearly as much soreness. And over time, you're going to experience less and less soreness because of that repeated bout effect. So yes, do your uphill workouts like you normally would before Boston, but let's also take a lot of stock on these downhill workouts because they are going to prepare you really well for the downhills at Boston. I also made the absolute classic mistake that almost everyone will make at Boston, which is I started too fast. The second mile at the Boston Marathon has a pretty significant elevation drop, and I was running too much on feel. And so I was running what felt like marathon pace, but ended up being about more than 15 seconds faster than my PR marathon pace, which was just too aggressive early in the race. And the problem with going out fast on a downhill that early in a marathon, which is a sneaky reason why Boston is so difficult, is that you incur a lot of muscle damage. And that comes back to bite you later on in the marathon. Now, a lot of folks are like, well, maybe I can bank some time early in the race. That strategy almost never works out, and it's not one that I ever recommend in my coaching practice, because if you bank time early in a race, like a marathon, especially like the Boston Marathon, you are gonna have to pay back that time that you banked with interest in the second half of the race. So you're never going to kind of get ahead of your PR goal pace and have that work out for you. It's probably going to come back to bite you later on in the race. So don't make that mistake that I did. Don't go out too fast. If anything, go out a little bit slower than your goal pace at the Boston Marathon, because you don't want to go too hard at the beginning. Help yourself warm up. Be a little bit more conservative on those early downhills, and your legs are going to be feeling a lot better by halfway through and into the second half of the race. Okay, let's talk about fueling. I really wish I had run my Boston Marathon these days, when we know a lot more about fueling than we did 10 years ago. So I ran my 2:45 Boston Marathon in 2014, the year after the unfortunate bombing incident at the Boston Marathon. And we did actually understand how much carbohydrate is truly necessary to fuel a max performance, especially in a race like a marathon, where the intensity is significantly higher and carbohydrate is more needed than, say, an event like a 100-mile ultramarathon. And so looking back at my old training logs, I realized I actually only consumed 2 gels per hour. I had one 24-gram carbohydrate gram gel every 30 minutes, which ends up being only 48 grams per hour. That is not enough. There's a lot of runners now who are literally taking double that and really getting a lot more carbohydrate in. And I never felt great in the final 5 or 6 miles of my marathons. The recovery for me was always very difficult, and I attribute that partly to fueling. So when you're running Boston, let's really aim for probably, 60 to 75 is what I would say the minimum, but 75 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour might be the top end of where most runners are going to find themselves. So just experiment during training, find an amount of carbohydrate that you really respond to, that doesn't irritate your gut, because fueling is just a huge piece of the puzzle of trying to engineer a PR in the marathon, especially on a course as difficult as the Boston Marathon. I could not make these videos without your support. So first, let me say thank you. And this video is brought to you by our very own Performance Training Journal. I have always been in love with hard copy training journals for a few really good reasons. Number one, when I was a new runner and I started keeping an actual training journal like this, I learned so much more about the sport and myself just by that practice. It really forces you to reflect on your training, to think more deeply about what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And if you are constantly reflecting on your training, praising yourself for what's going right, planning for the future, and then looking back on what has previously worked for you, you are gonna really know yourself as a runner, and you're gonna start to make wiser decisions about your training. I also created this training journal because I want you to focus on the training metrics that actually matter. The training metrics that help you improve, get better, and progress with your running. We don't have to focus on everything. We just need to focus on what matters. I also took a lot of inspiration from professional runners that I've talked to on the Strength Running podcast. They're adamant by completing a training journal and reflecting on what works for you and actually giving yourself some praise within your journal. You're essentially completing a gratitude journal. You are building up your confidence in your own abilities over time. And when you look back on that journal before a big goal race, you are going to be reading in your own words why you're capable, why you can do this. And I can think of nothing more confidence building than an act like that. So I hope you check out the new performance training journal. It is now available on Amazon. It debuted as the #4 new release in the running category, and I could not be more proud of it. So thank you again for subscribing to the Strength Running YouTube channel, and I hope you enjoy the performance training journal. The Boston Marathon also is a more logistically demanding type of marathon because of the fact that it's a point-to-point. You get bussed all the way out to Hopkinton. You have to stay in the athletes' village for a couple hours usually before the race. And then it starts later than usual. I'm not exactly sure now of the formal start of the first wave of the Boston Marathon, but it's about 10 in the morning. And whatever wave or corral that you're in, you're gonna be going later than that. So one of the things that I wish I had done when I was training for Boston is to plan a little bit more for the logistical challenges of Boston. You're gonna have to get up at 4 in the morning, but you're not racing until 6 or 7 hours later. That's very different than most marathons when you're getting up, say, really early in the morning, but the race starts at 7 in the morning. And so this is challenging from a fueling perspective. It's also challenging from the perspective of just figuring out what to do with all that time so that you're not on your feet for 6 hours, you're not, fatigued from all of that before you even line up on the starting line. So very practically speaking, here's what I would do. I would do some of my long runs with a very similar schedule. I would try to get up early, then have breakfast, wait, eat even more, and then 6 or 7 hours later, go for my long run. I think this is a really helpful way of just getting into that mindset of practicing the fueling that you're gonna do on race day. Because if you're not used to that, it is a bit jarring and you may experience a little bit more GI distress. You might experience a little bit more overall anxiety or stress because of, what it takes to, be sort of waiting for the marathon for that long. Anyone who's run track and you get to wait 8 hours from the start of the track meet because you're the final event of the track meet, you understand that that's a little stressful and it's not the most fun thing to do, is wait around to race. So let's wait around a little bit during training so that we're actually mentally and physically prepared for it on race day. Finally, let's talk about long runs. Because Boston is so difficult, because those big hills in Newton don't start until miles 18 or 19 or so, and you're going to be navigating the most difficult part of the marathon course while you are experiencing the beginnings of the peak of marathon fatigue. In other words, they come at the worst possible time. And the Boston Marathon is sort of like the more advanced marathon that probably shouldn't be your first marathon, or else it's just going to be super, super challenging. And so from a training perspective, I think runners training for the Boston Marathon have to pay a lot more attention to the type of long runs that they're doing. So in other words, don't just go run 18, 19, 20 miles on flat terrain. Maybe you're running around the Charles River in Boston or wherever you might live, just staying on flat elevation. I think that's a real mistake when it comes to Boston training, because we've got to get our legs used to the fact that we need to be running uphills and downhills pretty regularly. And so just generally hilly terrain is going to be super helpful for any runner training for the Boston Marathon, because you want your legs to experience both uphills and downhills and a whole variety of them. Some short and steep, some long and more shallow of a grade. Same thing with downhills. You want to just experience a whole variety of these types of hills at a whole variety of fatigue levels. So navigating hilly terrain when you're only 3 miles into a run is very different than navigating hilly terrain when you're already 18 or 19 miles into a long run. So try to get on really hilly terrain as much as you can for your long runs if you're training for Boston. It's going to make you a stronger runner. Like Frank Shorter said, hills are speed work in disguise. I would like to amend that quote and say hills are also strength training in disguise. So you're gonna get a lot stronger. It's gonna build speed. It's gonna build some additional aerobic capacity because your heart rate's gonna be a little higher, but you're not actually running any faster because you're going uphill. So you get that extra aerobic development of being in a higher zone without the mechanical stress of actually having to run faster. A lot of things to love about running hilly terrain, but for the Boston Marathon runner, it's even more important. So go forth, runners, dominate the famous Boston Marathon course. It is a very unique, special race, often called the world's most prestigious marathon. It was started in the 19th century. There really is something magical about the Boston Marathon. So if this is your first, enjoy it, soak it up. It's gonna be a truly special experience. And if it's not your first, but maybe you're going for a fast time, I hope this video was helpful for you as you try to navigate the training process and also the race execution and logistics of the Boston Marathon. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Strength Running channel and don't miss the Strength Running podcast and strengthrunning.com for more training guidance should you need it. Best of luck, runners.